If we go to register.php, we've got a pretty standard form here, I would say. So we're putting in our load file here, so we have access to all of our config file and our database class and our login class. And then we're doing the same thing we did before, and actually I have logins here. This should be handle. You can see I just copied it straight over. Handle registrations, or registration, and then we change this to register status, but we're just calling the method login register. So before we were using, on the login page, we're using actually on the index page, if we come right here, we were using verify login. I basically just copied this over here and changed it to register. So we're going to call this register method, which we are adding to our login class, and we'll get to that in a second. We have our header included. The form is pretty standard. The only thing that's really different is the action. Instead of submitting to index.php, because index.php is what handles our logins, we're going to submit this to itself. So we're just going to leave the action blank, and this form will submit to itself. And then we're going to use the post method. We have a sort of a status message here. We'll kind of get to that in just a second. It doesn't really make sense until you understand what's new in the class. But as far as the form, the fields are all pretty much the same, except we've added this field for full name, since we're registering, and that's one of the fields that we want to collect. So whereas before on the login form, you're only asking for the username and password because that's all you need to log them in. Here, when they register, we're also asking for their full name so that we have that data. Now, of course, the more data you want to collect and be able to display in your kind of members area or your admin area or your logged in area, the more you would ask for information here, and you'd have to change of course, your database to be able to store that data and so forth. But I think you kind of get the idea here. This form is really pretty much the same as the login form. And then we added a link down here to the login form here. So when someone submits this form, what's going to happen is it's going to trigger this if block right here, because the request method will have been post, and it's going to pass the post data to this register method that we added over here in our login class. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at that register method. So what we're doing with the register method is we're passing in our post data. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to check and see if the username that was passed in on our registration form already exists, because we can't really do anything if it already exists. So I created this helper function or helper method called user exists. And so if we come down here, and in that we're going to pass in the username that was submitted in our post data. So what we do down here is we just run a simple query to our database, and we're going to select all of the information from our users table where the username equals the username that was passed in. Now, this get results method here is specific to this database class that I wrote, and it allows you, this does use prepared statements, and so it allows you to use prepared statements without actually having to write all of the binding and the executing and the preparing and all that stuff yourself. The database class handles all of that. And so basically what you pass into the database class is your query with your placeholder in it, so that's right here, and then the actual array of data to fit into. So this element, username, matches up to this placeholder, and it will pass in this data using prepared statements. It'll bind it correctly and all that. So really handy, makes this a lot easier to run prepared statements and queries this way. Helps abstract that from actually being in this login class. So what this is going to give us back is the results of this are going to be it's going to be an array with all of our user data. So it's going to be, if we go to users, it's going to be an array with this data, the ID, the username, the password, and the name. And so since we are already running that query, instead of just returning true or false, what we're actually going to do, our database class, if we look at the get results method, if there are results, it's going to return the results, but if there's not, it's just going to return false. So what we're going to check for here is to make sure that false isn't what was returned from that query. If false was returned, then we're going to skip this block essentially, and we're going to return false down here. However, if it was not false, then we're going to return the user. And this is a little quirk of this, because this is the get results method. It actually puts the results into an indexed array. Now in this case, there's only going to be one element, because there's only one user whose username is going to match this username. So there's only one element in the array, so we have to return the element at the 0 index. So it's a little bit of a quirk, but it's not really a huge deal here. So we're going to return that user data using this user exists block. So because we're already running the query, we're going to just kind of save ourselves a little bit of performance and just grab all the data, because we're going to need it anyway. And so that's what we're doing here. So again, this returns false if the user does not exist. So if the user doesn't, if the user does not equal false, meaning that basically if the user exists, that already exists, then we're going to return this array with a status of 0, which means basically is for false, and say this username already exists. And I'll show you where we're going to use these messages here in a second, but in this particular method, instead of just returning true or false, because we have multiple things that could happen, the username could already exist, the count could be created successfully, or there could be some sort of unknown error. Because we have multiple things and we won't know exactly which one, we can't really just return true or false if we want to display useful status messages. And in particular, this one right here. We want to be able to tell them that the username already exists. So we're going to return, instead of just returning false, we're going to return an array that says, hey, it didn't work, and then gives a message that we can use. Right, so if the username exists, we're going to return that. However, if it doesn't exist, then we'll continue on here, and we're going to go ahead and insert that user into the database. So we're using the insert method from the database class. We're going to insert it into the users table. We're going to insert into the username field. We're going to insert the post data from the username. Now again, remember, these database class methods, that database class does the prepared statements for you. So I'm not putting in unescaped, unprepared data here. It may look like it here because I'm not doing anything, passing post username straight into this method, but this method does all of that for us. Okay, so again, passing the username into the username field. The password, we're running password hash. So this password hash is a built-in PHP function that we have now that works really, really well. Strongly recommend you use it over anything that you may have ever seen in the past, me or anybody else do. This is the latest and greatest way to hash passwords. And because it's a built-in PHP function, PHP, as it upgrades and updates, is going to continue to do all the things necessary to hash this properly, so we don't have to worry about it. And so we pass in the password that the user entered when they submitted the registration form, and we use this algorithm password default. I want to really recommend to you, unless you really have a good reason, solid reason, know why exactly, I want to recommend that you use password default, because password default is going to use the latest and greatest algorithm. PHP, again, as it upgrades, is going to use the best algorithm available. So this will basically ensure that you are always using the best algorithm to hash the password, instead of you having to figure it out. You can just let them handle that. So use password default. That's going to hash the password for us, and then we're going to pass in our name from our post data here as well. So we got our username, our password, and our name all are going to be inserted into our database using our database class. So if that method from the database class is just going to return true or false. It was either inserted or it wasn't. And so if it's true, then we're going to return a status message of 1, and that the account, or a status of 1, a message of the count created successfully. If it didn't, it'll skip this block, and it'll come down to this return, and it'll return 0, and there was some sort of unknown error occurred. We don't really know what the error is. This is something that'll be pretty rare. If it's probably going to be something to do with your database I mean, you're going to have bigger problems, I guess is what I would say, if that's getting triggered. All right, so that register form then or this register method will insert the user into the database if that username is unique, and it will return us a status message that we can work with. So if we come over here to register, we can see register status is set to whatever this register method returns. So register status is going to be set to that array with the status and then the message, depending on whether the username existed, whether it was inserted correctly, etc. It's going to give us that back. So because of that, we can then display appropriate messages here. So first we're going to check and see if register status is set, right? Because if this was even, because if there was no post data submitted, it's not even going to be set, so we don't need to display anything. And then if it was set, we're running a ternary here. And basically what this ternary is checking is if the status is equal to true, which 1, if you don't use 3 equals here, if you don't use strict, 1 is the same as true. It's not the same as true, but it will make this will evaluate to true for that status message of 1. So this will, if that status is set to 1, then this will be true, and in that case, the class will set this class variable to success. And if it's not, if the status message is not true, then it will set this class variable to error. So down here is where we then echo whatever that class is. So this is for our message. So this basically is so we can give the proper CSS for an error message or for a success message. So it allows us to change that class based on what we got back from our database query. Then down here, instead of hard coding a status message, we just echo out the status message that we got back from our login script. So it'll be one of these messages right here: username already exists, account created successfully, or an unknown error occurred, depending on which of those happens to be true. All right, so that's how we handle our error messages. And just real quick, if we go to the register and let's do John Morris, that should already exist. Yeah, that's how we get that username right here, or that error message right here. Okay, so that shows you the registration part of it. Now let's go into how we verify this.